we get to. So briefly, a word. Here we go. A word about the Sound Defense Alliance. The mission of the Alliance is to work to protect our communities and our natural environments from the harmful impacts of military activity around the Salish Sea, Puget Sound, and the Olympic Peninsula. The organization is a coalition of groups and individuals that have come together to restore the balance between community and military priorities across the Pacific Northwest. It has become the go-to organization in the region on the issue of growler jet noise. Please go to the websites of the Sound Defense Alliance and Citizens of EB's Reserve to learn more. We'll make sure we put these websites in the chat function.
Great. So with that introduction, Anne, thank you so much for welcoming us all in. Hi, everyone. My name is Gio Jacuzzi. As Anne mentioned, I am one of the folks working on the data analysis part of this project. And kind of just to start us off, we wanted to highlight some of the project objectives. Primarily, number one, quantifying community exposure to noise pollution from these pervasive growler military aircraft activities. And number two, evaluating the potential human health and well-being implications of this noise exposure for people and help everyone in the community understand, what are the extents of these impacts, what are the risks associated with them, and provide some context with data to back it up to ultimately help inform policy and mitigation options. So this is a high-level overview of the project. If you joined us for the first webinar, this will be familiar, but to give you a sense of where we are and where we're going, we started with a large database of noise data that spans several locations throughout Washington, but are primarily concentrated around the naval air bases on Whidbey. So we've conducted analyses of these data to quantify and characterize the noise. How loud is it? Where and when is it occurring? And with these findings, we're using public health exposure response relationships to estimate the health and well-being impacts associated with this kind of noise exposure. So this is what connects the raw numbers that we've measured and calculated to the human experience that many people on this call are experiencing, being affected by the noise that is so prevalent. And today I would like to walk you through some of these preliminary results that we've produced. The final stage of the project, which is what we've most recently begun, is mapping the distribution of noise at scale across the landscape. And this will give us a broader kind of community and population level understanding of the health risks that it implies. But like I said, today we're going to focus on sharing some initial results and discussing how those results relate to the experiences that many of you in the community have shared with us. So we've received through Quiet Skies over 5,000 noise complaints last year alone. And what you see here on screen is a word cloud that represents the most common words that were present across all of these complaints. So the size of the word indicates how prevalent it is in the data. For example, the word loud occurred in nearly 1,500 complaints. And you'll notice that there are several other keywords that come up frequently, words like rumble and roar, another, constant, night and sleep. We see many words that are indicative of people's experiences with the noise. And so we thought, let's run some analyses to see what patterns in the data emerge and can support these concepts. And so we focused on three overarching themes: loudness, frequency of operations, and night flights. These themes were consistently coming up in the noise complaints, and by putting some data behind them, we can gain insight into why they're so common, and specifically what are the things that are driving them. Why are these kinds of complaints showing up? So for the remainder of this webinar, we're going to look at each of these themes one by one, But before we dive in, I want to introduce some quick background on the data that we're using exactly. So our data set's a large collection of over 11 years of combined monitoring efforts by several different organizations, including the Sound Defense Alliance, Citizens of EB's Reserve, and several others. So we're using this data from more than 50 sampling sites, some of which you can see on the map on screen here of Whidbey. And at each of these sites, we have noise data from either a microphone or a sound pressure level meter, or in some cases, both. And in total, this is yielding tens of thousands of hours of recorded measurements that we can use to gain a really fine understanding of what's going on with growler noise in the area. So with this data in hand, let's start with some analyses and begin with this topic of loudness. So as one complaint stated, when those jets fly over, it's so painful that I have to run inside and cover my ears. So exactly how loud are these events? This is an example of a typical noise event from a field carrier landing practice operation at Coupeville Airfield. So on the x-axis of this graph is time in seconds, spanning about a minute total. And on the y-axis is the measured sound pressure level in decibels. So you can see that the loudness ramps up until it reaches a peak of about 110 decibels, after which it returns down over time to where it began. And it turns out that the average noise event loudness at many monitoring locations is 108 decibels, plus or minus 5, and can peak as high as 118. Importantly, this enters the range at which direct hearing impairment can occur, which is beyond 115 decibels. So let's let that sink in. These are very loud events just on its surface, but there's another way to look at a noise event in more detail than what we see here with what's called a spectrogram. So a spectrogram takes a sound wave and separates it into individual frequency components, which is just a fancy way of saying it shows the pitch or the highness and lowness of a sound over time. So on the x-axis here in this figure, we have the same time in seconds as before, but on the y-axis, we have the range of frequencies present, starting at 0 and going all the way to 20,000 at the top. So the higher the frequency, the higher the pitch, right? And the color that you see in this plot, ranging from black to purple to red and yellow, that corresponds to the intensity or the loudness in a given frequency range at a particular time. So you can see how the peak of our sound wave on the top corresponds to the brightest band of color in the spectrogram below. And what we can see here when we look at the brightest area of the spectrogram, it shows us that frequencies between around 100 to 5,000 hertz are typically the loudest parts of these kinds of noise events. And unfortunately, we know from the literature that long-term hearing loss typically occurs from repeated exposure to loud noise in the 3,000 to 6,000 hertz range. And you can see the overlap here represented as this outlined red band on the spectrogram, and it gradually fades as you go down. So this range of frequencies is a range that humans are particularly sensitive to, and it's likely a big factor in why we receive so many complaints of ear pain and fatigue specifically. And it's important to notice that, with increasing loudness, impairment can occur beyond this band at lower frequencies specifically. Speaking of lower frequencies, something else important to note here is that we can see from this brightness of the spectrogram in the lower register that low frequencies of a noise event extend all the way down below 20 hertz. And that's around where we start to feel sound as a physical vibration rather than just hearing it with our ears. So what you see in this plot here, this range, this is the reason why growler flights can shake and rattle windows of your home and building structures. which is, again, something we often see mentioned in noise complaints. Now, obviously, this is just one example of a single noise event, but in reality, a given day of flight activity involves many of these events, right? So this is an example of an FCLP session as a whole. You can see there's many noise events happening within the span of 1 hour, and the majority of these events are actually peaking over 100 decibels. The noise events are often repetitive. They can be kind of variable in occurrence and irregular in the onset of the noise and the duration. And, individual training sessions we've seen from the data can last anywhere from 30 minutes to more than an hour. And it's often that there are several training sessions occurring within a single day. So this kind of repeated exposure, right, led us to investigate, what effect can this have on auditory health? If we know that a single event can be threatening, what does a series of these events over time mean for the people that are hearing them? So we found that all of the monitoring sites on Whidbey Island that we have been able to pull from reached loudness levels that can pose a risk of hearing impairment over long periods of time, according to the International Organization for Standardization. In addition, we found that sites within 2 miles of the Coupeville airfield, which is what you can see outlined in this map here, this area surpassed the recommended exposure limit by the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. So in other words, these are beyond the level that is deemed safe for people at work. Moreover, there were days with multiple FCLP sessions that surpassed exposure thresholds that are set by the Navy's hearing conservation program itself, which would require the issue of hearing protection and testing for Navy employees. So ultimately, when we consider the number of sessions and events that are present per day, we can actually estimate where and when and how often these exposure levels can be reached across the region. So this tells us a lot about the severity of individual noise events and training sessions too. But what about the impacts over longer periods of time? For that, we can use what's called the day, evening, night average level, or the LDEN for short. So LDEN is a single number that represents the average loudness level of an entire day, and it takes into account the fact that we're more sensitive during evening and late night hours when we're getting ready to go to bed. So it's a pretty useful metric to broadly characterize how noise levels change over long periods of time. We're talking about scales of years typically. And the figure that you see here is a box plot of LDEN values that we calculated for a handful of our monitoring sites. So on the x-axis, you see there's LDEN levels in decibels increasing as we go to the right. And on the y-axis are individual locations that we've monitored. So the boxes that you see for each of these locations, they summarize all of the LDEN values that we measured from every day monitored at every site. So to get into that a little bit more, the kind of whisker looking lines on either end of the boxes, those point to, on the left end, the quietest day, and on the right end, the loudest day that was recorded. And the 2 sides of the box represent, the first and third quartiles of the data, and the dark line in the middle is the median, or the halfway point between these values. But what I'd like you to focus on, don't get too distracted by that. What I want you to focus on is the large white circles that you see. So these represent the acoustic energy average of all LDENs at a location. So in other words, you can think of these as the average loudness of all of the days of events considered. So we found that average levels during days of flight activity were up to 28 decibels louder than natural ambient levels. And this means that flights, as we know, vastly change the soundscape of a location when they're operational. But importantly, we also see that noise levels frequently surpass official standards. So the EPA recommends an outdoor ambient level of at most 55 dB for communities, LDEN. So you can see this drawn as a blue line across the figure, right? And I want you to note how the average LDN, those white dots, of all of these sites is beyond that threshold. Additionally, both the Department of Housing and Urban Development and the Federal Aviation Administration lists 65 dB as incompatible with residential land use. And so we draw this as a red line at 65, and we find that nearly all sites have average LDN values that are officially considered incompatible, many of which are, we know, near or within residential homes and communities. So we've seen how growler noise poses threats to auditory health and exceeds official thresholds for safety and community well-being. So let's move on to our next theme, frequency of operations. So a good representative quote here, I'm complaining about the constant noise day after day, night after night. So we obtained detailed flight operations data for a subset of monitoring periods, specifically throughout 2021. And this bar graph shows us the days of the week on the x-axis for this monitoring period, and the average number of operations per day on the y-axis, and they're colored by airfield, right? So red for Altfield, blue for Coupeville. And we found that on average, during this monitoring period across 2021, the Navy executes more than 1,200 individual operations per week. 850-ish of these are based from Altfield, and a little more than 370 are from Coupeville. And during this monitoring period, we can see that operations were concentrated during weekdays. Although, you know, and I'm anticipating your reaction, we do have records of other periods that included activity on Friday and weekends. But for this period of data that we have, this operational data, we can take a deeper look. So we can see that Altfield has more operations in total, which includes several different kinds of maneuvers, which we can talk about later on, while Coupeville has comparatively less. However, the vast majority of operations at Coupeville are FCLP sessions, and we've seen those have very significant noise events. So what I'd like to do now is illustrate how these operations numbers translate into noise impacts. But to do that, we'll need to pick a couple of locations to use as examples that we can evaluate. So let's take a closer look at these two sites, the Clover Valley Dog Park and the National Park Service's Rubel Farm office at EB's Landing. So I've chosen these two sites because they are close to dense communities. They're near the intersection of multiple flight paths, and they're also exposed to noise from unique operation types that are emanating primarily from a particular airfield. So the dog park is just outside Altfield, and it experiences noise from aircraft departure and arrivals to and from the military operations area out on the Olympic Peninsula. And it also is subject to interfield movement and touch and go training noise as well. The Rubel Farm office is near the town of Coupeville, and it lies right underneath several of the flight paths in one of the FCLP loops. So using these two sites as examples, we can plot their average daily LDEN, right? So similar to our bar graph that we looked at before, which is now above, this line graph below shows days of the week on the x-axis, and then the average LDEN on the y-axis. And you can see immediately that, you know, during days of activity of operations, these levels are quite a bit higher. Specifically, they can increase by 20 to 30 dB on days of activity. And we found that because many different kinds of operations are coming from Altfield, you know, noise from that field impacts communities in Anacortes, in Lopez, the Olympic Peninsula, and more. Whereas with Coupeville, while it has a fewer number of total individual operations, it has much more acute noise impacts due to these pervasive FCLP activities. And you can see that in contrast it's quite a bit higher on the LDN graph than the alt field site. So now that we kind of have an understanding of what LDN levels look like over time, we can start to evaluate some long-term impacts on the well-being of people that are living near these locations. So before we get into further analysis, I want to just mention a brief disclaimer. A majority of the tools that exist for evaluating the impact of aircraft noise on human health and well-being are based on data from commercial flights. The vast majority of the literature is about commercial flights. Military aircraft, as you know, sounds much different. It's far more intense, it's faster, it's more sporadic in nature. And because of this, we expect that several of the following impact assessments could be conservative estimates. So I'd like you to bear that in mind. We'll discuss the limitations of working with models that were designed and based on civilian or commercial data later on. So it's no surprise that people find growler noise annoying. The word annoy even shows up very frequently in the word cloud of complaints. But estimating annoyance is actually very important because it's a fundamental aspect of evaluating well-being, because it reflects someone's psychological state of mind, and cumulative exposure to stressors like noise that increase annoyance can ultimately impact the state of the body over time as well, right? And that can lead to negative health effects in a cascading kind of way. So in this way, we can think of annoyance as an indicator of health and well-being. And interestingly, we can actually quantify the expected annoyance of people within a community in response to noise exposure. And we do this with what's called an exposure response relationship. And this is something that describes the magnitude of a response of a person as a function of exposure to a stressor. So it's often used in human health sciences, as Dr. Sito knows very well, to estimate the response of receiving a certain dose of a substance or a toxin. And in our case, the toxin exposure is noise pollution, and the response is the likelihood of annoyance. So we can leverage exposure response functions that are derived from survey data from communities that live within the vicinity of airports around the world to estimate how likely someone is to be highly annoyed by noise at a given LDN value. So in this graph that you see on screen, we have LDN on the x-axis, and we have a percent of the population that's estimated to be highly annoyed on the y-axis. And generally, as LDN goes up, so does the percentage of the population that's highly annoyed. But notice that we have three different lines here that exhibit unique relationships between LDN and annoyance. Each one represents an exposure response that's found from a large collection of surveys around the world. The purple one, labeled standard, is a response from the International Organization for Standardization, and it's what they suggest is used for estimating community annoyance worldwide. The black line, labeled guideline, is the response that the World Health Organization suggests is used in the European region for evaluating annoyance. And both the purple and the black lines, again, I want to make this point, are based on data from civil and commercial aircraft. So we wanted to find if there is a relationship out there that describes military noise, particularly with US aircraft, at best with growlers out there in the literature. So this blue military line does that. It represents a higher annoyance that military aircraft activity tend to induce in comparison to commercial aircraft. And this is a synthesis of studies that was made in Japanese communities that live near military airports in Japan that experience noise from US and Japanese air forces. So just note that the steepness of these curves indicate the degree of the relationship between noise and annoyance. Obviously, the military one is assuming a steeper relationship than, for example, the standard. And using these relationships, we can actually estimate the percentage of the population that is expected to be highly annoyed at all of our monitoring sites. So let's use Dog Park near Altfield as an example. This location had an average LDN value of 73 decibels. So we put a vertical line at 73 on the x-axis. That line intersects with the purple standard curve at this point, and we can see that corresponds to an estimated 49% of the local population being highly annoyed according to the standard. The line intersects with the black curve at 62%, which corresponds to the WHO guideline. And finally, you might be surprised to see that there's no intersection with the blue military curve. The relationship at this loudness level isn't known because it's beyond the maximum value that was recorded in the survey data that forms that curve. So this means that Dog Park exhibited LDN values that are quite literally off the charts of this model. And because of this, we can only assume that the estimated annoyance is going to be equal to or greater than the highest value it's defined for, which in this case is 77%. So an important caveat to mention here is that, you know, the shape of these curves, the military curve in particular, might be influenced by cultural differences, and it could possibly yield an overestimation of annoyance. But conversely, it's important to keep in mind that the guideline and standard curves, because they're based on commercial aircraft, they could therefore yield underestimations of annoyance. So this range of possibilities is important for us to kind of consider when we're quantifying annoyance across sites. And as that would imply, we can do the same calculation for every monitoring site in our database, linking LDNs to annoyance estimates to understand what annoyance is like at a larger spatial scale. So when we do that, we get something like this table. This shows the percentage of the local population around these monitoring sites that's estimated to be highly annoyed using these exposure response relationships. So as an example, if we look at the Reeder Bay location, a majority of people living in that area are expected to be highly annoyed, with the standard curve estimating 56%, the guideline at least 66%, and the military at least 77%. And note how a lot of these average loudness values exceed the ranges for which the relationships are defined. So it's possible that a percentage of the population is actually highly annoyed in these circumstances. That percentage could be larger. And I think it just goes to show the extreme nature of this kind of noise exposure, because in many ways it's unprecedented in the literature. And just as a final point here, I want to underline again that these numbers represent cumulative exposure over long periods of time, typically yearly. So these are the kinds of scenarios and timescales that can induce lasting health impacts. So we've quantified frequency of operations over multiple days, entire weeks of time, and we've seen that pervasive exposure at this kind of temporal scale can result in high levels of annoyance, as we would expect, but levels that we know that over time can be linked to well-being and serious health impacts. What I want to do now is take a closer look at a particularly sensitive time period that also has significant health implications, and that's the night. So night flights, it's 11 p.m. and the planes have been buzzing so low and so loud, it's actually rattling our windows and woke me up from my sleep. In the same way that we looked at average flight operations for a monitoring period day by day throughout the week, we can do the same thing, but break it down by hour. So this bar graph that you see shows the average operations per hour of an active day of flying, with the hour of the day on the x-axis, right? And we can see that for the monitoring periods under consideration, there are typically 230 operations per day, with about 120 based at Altfield and more than 100 at Coupeville. And looking at the shape of these graphs, these two colors, you'll notice that alt operations for this period began in earnest at around 8 o'clock in the morning. They peaked around 1 p.m. and they continued occurring up until midnight. And Kufill operations, in contrast, they tended to begin later at 11 a.m., but they were much more active in the evening and night, again, all the way up to midnight. So as a whole, we can see that Navy flight operations are prevalent during school and working hours, evening and late night time hours for this monitoring period. And I'll add a caveat to that saying we do have data showing activity at hours beyond midnight for other periods, but not the same fine level of detail in the operations themselves. So if we graph the average loudness per hour at our 2 sample sites from before, we see that values increase by 15 to 37 dB during flight operations. And these noise impacts are substantial and they're fairly consistent all the way up to midnight, with average levels at Rubel Farm, teetering around 85 dB. The shading that you see here kind of indicates evening and nighttime hours in purple and blue. So if we consider just the nighttime, we can begin to understand what noise communities are exposed to during sleeping hours. Similar to LDEN, we can use Lnight to calculate a single decibel value that represents the average nighttime level. So this box plot that we see, it shows Lnights calculated with that Lnight value on the x-axis and then individual site locations on the y-axis again. And as before, the boxes that you see, they summarize all of the Lnight values that were measured from every night that was monitored at each location. So the lines on either end, the left one points to the minimum, the quietest night, and the line on the right points to the loudest night. The dots are outliers, but still maximums. The middle line, right, that's the median. But again, focus on the large white circles. Those are the things that represent the average loudness overall throughout the night. And we found that levels during nights of flight activity were up to 29 dB higher than natural ambient levels. Moreover, we found that Lnight levels frequently surpass guidelines that are specified by the World Health Organization. So we know that noise levels from 40 to 45 decibels can produce observable adverse health effects from reduced sleep quality. Past 55 dB, which is what you see in this purple line, these health effects become significantly more frequent, and their impact does as well on a population scale. So note that the majority of sites are at or beyond this threshold. Excuse me. Now, cumulative exposure of nighttime noise over long periods of time leads to health impacts, right? And just as we used exposure response relationships to estimate annoyance, we can do the same thing for sleep disturbance. The curve that you see in purple here is derived from guidelines from the World Health Organization that have been updated with a more recent study to include some more recent surveys on sleep disturbance from around the world. So this response, this curve represents sleep disturbance insofar as it's the combined effect of different kinds of sleep disturbance, right? So this includes the more obvious ones like awakening, waking up, or falling asleep, having difficulty falling asleep, as well as less pronounced effects like maintaining or changing sleep stages. So again, I'd like you to note that this curve is derived from civil and commercial aircraft data. And we really don't know exactly how military activity specifically affects sleep disturbance because of these unique properties like intensity and low frequency energy. Because of that, the estimates that we make with this relationship might be conservative. So just keep that in mind. So as we did before, let's go ahead and calculate the probability for high sleep disturbance at our example site at the dog park near Altfield. The Lnight that we measured for this site on average was 62 dB. So we draw a vertical line at that level. That intersects the purple curve at this point here, which corresponds to an estimate of about 44% probability of being highly sleep disturbed. Right, so within the location nearby, 44%, it's a 44% likelihood that you living in that local area would experience some level of high sleep disturbance over the course of long periods of time. And again, we can do the same kind of calculation for each of our monitoring sites, and we get the following result. So in this table, we have the site in the left column and the estimated probability of high sleep disturbance in the right column. And in general, it shows that high sleep disturbance is likely prevalent throughout Whidbey Island and its surrounding communities, particularly given that more severe responses, right, are expected from military aircraft versus the commercial aircraft that this model is derived from. We can see that loudness values can exceed the range for which this exposure response relationship is defined at the Rubel Farm location. And there at least 50%, it's statistically likely that high sleep disturbance is occurring for people in that local area. And again, cumulative exposure of this kind of nighttime noise over long periods of time can lead to other kinds of health impacts, because a good night's rest is central in maintaining a healthy body and a healthy mind. So a caveat to consider here is that because this is a long-term average exposure, it's not applicable to, for example, awakenings from specific noise events, which is something that we do see reported in the noise complaints, right? But that touches on some of the open analyses that we're currently working on and that we're working towards, which we can move on to. Let's see. So just to summarize, we've seen how the data analysis we need to empirically support these common themes of experience are possible. These things that people are experiencing and reporting from communities that are affected by Navy aircraft noise. So that was a lot of graphs and figures, so thank you for bearing with me through it. But now I'd like to change gears and briefly discuss the next steps of this project. So with these kind of fundamental analyses completed, we want to perform some additional health and well-being evaluations. And the ultimate goal is mapping the spatial distribution of noise exposure and its associated impacts across the region. So specifically, like I mentioned before, we're planning to estimate the probability of waking from individual noise events. We want to quantify the variability and the predictability of days and nights of flight activity. And we want to take a look at the effects from alternative metrics that are unique to this kind of military noise. So fast onset, the way that noise can rush at you in such a way that is not typical of an overhead Alaska Airlines flight, and other things like low frequency energy. We also want to investigate potential impacts on childhood learning and cognitive development, as well as the increased risk that's associated with noise exposure chronically for cardiovascular disease. So ultimately, we're going to map these results to understand the full spatial extent of the issue. We're going to do this, using a noise mapping software from the Department of Defense. It's a software model that correlates well with what we've seen from on-the-ground measured data that we've collected. And what this model does is it takes in flight operations data, and it takes in terrain information for Washington, and it uses that to produce detailed spatial estimates of the resulting noise exposure over long periods of time. And the output is what you see in this picture here. These are LDN noise contours that we developed with aggregated flight operations data that we received from 2021. So you can see in this map, there are bands of decibel ranges that are outlined and colored, with 50 to 60 being yellow, 60 to 70, excuse me, being orange, and 80 and up being red. And the important thing is, by modeling the spatial exposure like this, we can estimate the likelihood of impacts across the region and compare overlap with layers like noise complaints, or population and demographics, or land use and ordinances, and flight tracks as well. And we can also estimate noise exposure at specific points of interest that we currently lack physical monitoring data for. So that could include individual schools or specific neighborhoods and parks. So in summary, with these large-scale results, we'll be well equipped, I think, to understand the extent of noise pollution in the region and its health and well-being impacts. And ultimately, that can support our goal of moving towards actionable solutions. So thank you so much for your time and attention. I really appreciate it. Our team really appreciates it. And with the time that we have left, let's see, we'd be happy to open the floor for any questions that folks listening in might have. I'll pass it over to Anne and the rest of the team board to help moderate.
Thank you, Gio. Excellent job of conveying so much information in a really relatively short period of time. So in looking at what has been entered so far, and let me just encourage you, we still have another 12 minutes to our webinar, so feel free to enter your questions and comments. And if a lot pour in towards the end, we'll do our best to get through as many as we can. There's a question about the aircraft that you may choose to enter at the reporting site. And Brian, I believe, answered that with the comment of basically saying, I don't know if you can't make a good guess. So thank you, Brian, for responding to that. And then Cliff noted that it's important to note that commercial aircraft are noise limited by the FAA, whereas military aircraft are not, which is a really important distinction. I believe Paula Spina echoed that as well, in terms of federal law trumping local laws, plus the federal government as the sovereign can only be sued if they allow you to sue. This is one who knows this very well, as Paula has been very involved in the suits that Corps has thankfully submitted. We cannot sue them for violating local noise ordinances because they have not allowed it. And that is in response to Cliff Stummer's question about investigating the legalities of the growlers repeatedly violating local noise ordinances, typically 85 decibels. And just acknowledge, for those of you who are under track 14, Bruce and Paula and an additional person identified as 138. People are being impacted right now as we're in the midst of this webinar. It's hard for people like Bruce and others to hear. And thanks, Edmund, for entering the website to report noise complaints. Just a reminder that this recording will be made available to everyone, and it does include the slides. So you will get video and the slides. And it looks like Cliff is commenting also that thanking Paula, acknowledging that in Michigan, they're looking at Michigan law versus the Michigan Air National Guard. And that, if I understand correctly, is where the F-35s have been moved or are in the process of being moved to Ann Arbor. So Cliff, thanks for joining us from Ann Arbor. And let's see, other questions. We have folks in Port Townsend and folks from out of state. I know that Arlene, welcome. Arlene Bronzaft is here from New York and is a really well-recognized researcher on this topic of
Thank you.
noise impact. Well, it's always great to see you and hear from you, Arlene.
Thank you. The same here. Thank you to the speaker. Thank you.
And thanks. And then Kathleen, thanks for your question. Do you have any data on the impact on land and water animals? Lauren, do you want to speak to that? Or who would like to speak to that? I'll leave it open. Who would like to respond?
I was thinking that I could try and jump in on that question. Kathleen, that is a great question. So the exposure response curves that Gio was showing, how we would estimate impact on people, those exist for people because of the results of studies that have been done. But even as Gio noted, the studies that have been done are on commercial aircraft. I would say that those types of studies are even more limited when we want to think about impacts on animals. So there are ways to do the same types of things. We're assessing the noise levels, thinking about specific animals and their responses. But those kind of exposure response curves are, I mean, they just don't even exist really. Effectively, they're really not going to exist. So our ability to definitively quantify the impacts on animals is even more limited than it is for people. We are, however, the great thing is that the noise mapping and the exposure modeling that Gio is doing, it is relevant to wildlife. And those, once we have those exposure models done, we can start to extrapolate and think about, well, what kind of research gaps do we need? What animals are most sensitive that maybe, bear more investigation specifically? What kind of studies need to be done with sensitive wildlife? Obviously, our our listed endangered species, orcas, murrelets, there's are high targets for that kind of thing. So anyway, long story short, these results can inform the types of studies that would need to be done to better assess impacts on animals.
Thank you, Lauren. Any additions to that? Anybody else want to say anything else about the impact on land and water animals? All right, let's keep going. Thank you, Cliff, for acknowledging the DoD noise work group. That's important, an important group for us to be connected to and aware of. Ruth comments on having to move from Lopez because of the growlers. Bill Blake asks, using the noise mapping model, will you be inputting the actual noise data that has been collected, especially since the growlers have been flying, and mapping those decibel levels versus hypothetical noise data? Who would like to respond?
Yeah, I can talk to that. That's
Thank
a great
you.
question. Thank you for sharing that question. So where to begin? Essentially, we can think about the results that we've looked at today, right? These are coming from physical monitoring locations. And we've done this, if we put these on a map, we can see hotspots relatively of, where in this general area we can assume, based on what the microphone of the SPL meter is recorded, this is the exposure in that area. But because it's only recorded at that one individual location, it's really limited in terms of its spatial perspective, because the way that noise is received over time, if I'm, standing at the monitoring location versus on the other hill or, 20 blocks westward, for example, it's going to be fairly different, potentially. So what the noise map modeling software does is it does use real world data that's aggregated from individual noise events associated with flight operations that have been recorded in the past. And what it does is it tries to fill in those gaps for us. So we've measured empirically a couple spots, but we can use this software to extrapolate or interpolate in another way between these locations. And what the software does is it goes in and says, hey, I know that X, Y, and Z operations were being run for this many for at this frequency throughout a monitoring period, then it will calculate, I have a database of what noise, like a model for what that noise sounds like according to each of those operations and as affected by how many times the operation is run and where it's run. And then those estimated results will be outputted as the spatial distribution of the mapping software. So that was kind of a long-winded answer, but long story short, we're using this modeling software, which is based on real recorded data, but ultimately is making estimations of exposure based on operations data to fill in the gaps and get a much better and cohesive understanding of the spatial extent of the problem. And what we have done is we've validated the individual monitoring sites that we do have with the values that are predicted at those locations by the modeling software to be ensured that what the software is putting out and the way that these noise models work under the hood is consistent with more or less with what we're seeing on the ground empirically. So that's a great question. Thank you.
Thanks, Gio. So just in response to Marge about the report site, it's at 444. If you scroll up, you will see the link to the noise mapping and reporting site. So please take a look there. And Jamie Banks, welcome. I know Jamie, and I forgot to also acknowledge Tracy Williams, who are here from out of state, from the East Coast. Thank you for joining us. And Jamie's question is, will there be any effort in the future to link medical records to noise maps? Who would like to take that on?
I guess I can also take that on. So this team is intending to submit another proposal for a larger scale project, which would try and assess impacts. Survey, maybe not medical records. That's an interesting, really interesting idea, Jamie, though. But anyway, to link the noise exposure with population health impacts as surveyed by people that way. So that's one answer to that question. So there is a plan. It involves another proposal and another project.
Good, thank you.
Thanks, Lauren. And then Ashley asked the question about the certainty about these being growlers, which I believe Paula responded to, just acknowledging that we're 100% certain that the jets we experience are the EA-18G growlers. There are other jets that fly here, but the major noise is from Growler FCLPs. And Brian also added that there are P9s that fly from alt field that sound like a commercial jet. Let me just see. And Cliff, thanks for the correction. I stated F-35s. In Ann Arbor, it's F-16 slated to conduct air combat training at 500 feet later this year. So just a really powerful reminder that this is a national issue and we are working to stay connected to each other, those of us working across the US. So thanks, Chris Hurley, for entering one more time at 4:53, the website to report noise complaints.
And I wanted to point out that there's a question in the Q&A box that says, will the Navy threaten a person who calls the naval noise complaint number? I think the answer should be no.
Yes.
Sometimes they don't keep the information, but there's not any guarantee of a threat that comes as part of the deal. And if you're concerned about that in any way, you can also use the complaint line for that San Juan County keeps, Quiet Skies and San Juan County keeps for us, and that actually has more complaints than the Navy does. Thanks,
Chris. And then Jamie also asked about any effort to link children's learning indicators to noise maps. Lauren or Chris, do you want to speak to that any further, or Gio, in terms of the future, the tier 3 proposal and where we're headed?
I think it's the short answer is yes. The longer answer is limitations, right, in study design, sample sizes, that kind of thing. So Jamie, it would be great to hear more from you about your ideas. We are in the process of developing that tier 3 proposal right now.
Thanks, Lauren.
Thank you. And Brian also corrected himself, said they're P8s and not P9s, the Poseidons. And thank you, Cliff, for your last recommendation, to which Edmund Cito, Dr. Cito responded. And clearly a lot of accolades for the work that this team has been doing. Thank you, Geo, for all of your attention to providing a really extraordinary presentation. Let's see if there's.
And I've got one more question
Yep.
from the Q&A that says, are these data going to be sent to Murray, Larson, and Cantwell?
Mm, mm.
And I think that's a question that SDA can answer.
And the answer is yes, absolutely. We will make this available. We'll sort out the best way to do that. But yes, we've invited them to attend, and they aren't here today, but they will receive the link to the recording, and staff in their office, as well as our elected officials themselves. And it's 2 minutes after 5. So I just want to thank everyone for attending today. We really appreciate your participation, your interest, your support, and really hope that you'll attend our third webinar coming up at the end of our 1-year project here. And just an acknowledgement of this wonderful team as well. It's really exciting to work with University of Washington stellar researchers, scientists, and Bob from Citizens of EB's Reserve. And we have some great volunteers like Chris and Lauren, who've been really central